I've got a bit of a weird one for you today. Take a look at this footage. Do you notice anything strange about the gameplay? Aside from the fact I'm deliberately not doing any of the dungeon mechanics, I'm just using this area to demonstrate the build. And while you're thinking about that, why not like and subscribe, as it really helps out my channel. Thanks! This is Hunter gameplay from a -30 Master Ghosts of the Deep solo, at the Ekthar encounter where you are constantly surrounded by enemies, and you take a lot of damage from all the Acolytes, Knights, and enemy Arc Mods. And I'm still not dying, on a Hunter just running around with a glaive, using glaive melee and occasional projectile attacks. I'm on solar, but I'm not using my healing grenade or any of my other solar abilities. I'm never swapping to any other weapons, and in fact I'm not even raising the shield on the glaive I'm holding, not even once. Obviously, if I was using the glaive shield and my other abilities, my survivability would be even more comfortable. I'm just doing it like this to show you how good the core part of the build is before I go through all the other details. And although I'm showing Hunter gameplay here, this core setup will work on all classes, which I'll also cover later. But about that one weird thing I mentioned, did you spot it yet? Take a look at the buffs on the left side of the screen. I'm running Solar subclass and I have Radiant and Restoration active, which are refreshing as I get kills due to Ember of Empyrean, where Solar weapon and ability final blows extend the duration of both buffs. Except I'm not using any of my Solar abilities, and I'm not using a Solar weapon. This glaive is void. It deals void damage from projectiles, and the glaive melee is non-elemental. So how is this working? Well, the secret sauce in this build is the set bonus on the Apostate's Blade armor from the Pit of Heresy dungeon. The 2-piece regenerative threshold is kind of irrelevant and wasn't even active on the gameplay I just showed. But with it, performing a finisher stores power, and the next time your shields are broken, you heal and start health regen. So with it active, that would also add even more survivability to this build. But the 4-piece melee conduction is the important one. While you have Radiant, Restoration, or Cure, melee hits release a burst that scorches targets. And you guessed it, glaive melees count for this and apply the Scorch, which makes it count as a solar final blow for extending buffs with Ember of Empyrean. So at the very start of combat, I acrobat dodge to gain Radiant, use my healing grenade to apply Restoration, and then just chain glaive attacks to refresh both. So that's the core part of this build explained. Now let's go through the rest. On Hunter, super and aspects don't really matter, so it's down to personal preference. But I picked On Your Mark for 3 fragment slots, and the new Crackshot for another way to apply Scorch and Cure. On Titan, the Scorching Glaive melees can leave sunspots with the Sol Invictus aspect for even more restoration stacks and Empyrean refreshes, and as we need 3 fragment slots from the other aspect, you can pair it with either Shield Burst or Consecration. For Warlock, Touch of Flame makes Healing Grenade give restoration ×2 for much more aggressive healing, which we can refresh with the glaive melees as before. And we have to pair it with Icarus Dash for access to its 3 fragment slots. For fragments, we obviously have Ember of Empyrean to extend the Radiant and Restoration from our glaive melee final blows, Solace for increased duration of both buffs, and the combo of Searing to generate fire sprites from scorched targets, and Mercy for additional restoration when picking them up. Without these, it's very noticeable and restoration tends to run out much quicker, even with the glaive melee buff extensions. For the 5th and last fragment, on Hunter it's a free pick as we already get Radiant from Acrobat Dodge, but I'd go with either Singeing for faster class ability regen when scorching targets, or Ashes for more scorch stacks, potentially leading to an ignition when hitting multiple times against a single powerful enemy. Bungie recently nerfed the amount of Scorch this armor set applies, so it doesn't really work as a reliable ignition set anymore, but they can still happen occasionally. On Titan and Warlock though, the 5th fragment should be Torches to get Radiant from powered melee abilities at the start of combat, to then allow you to extend it. Radiant only buffs the glaive projectiles and our other weapons, not the glaive melee, and it doesn't proc from the glaive melees themselves either, so if Radiant ever runs out, you'll just need to dodge or use melee ability to start the loop again. And if Restoration runs out, just throw another healing nade. For all classes, we want 200 melee stat for 30% extra base melee damage, which does apply to glaive melees. Last year, Bungie changed how melee stacking works, with multiple sources of melee damage increases stacking additively instead of multiplicatively. But that additive stacking happens after the initial melee stat increase, so you definitely want 200 melee stat to multiply all the later damage buffs by 30%. I'd recommend putting your Ghost mod on Skirmisher for melee and weapon spikes when farming for this armor set, but bear in mind that as Pit of Heresy doesn't have a master mode, you have to wait for it to be a featured dungeon to be able to get tier 5s, so keep an eye out for it being on rotation. As the Imperium buff refreshes are quite small, we want to be ad clearing with our glaive melee as fast as possible to keep topping up and increasing the buffs. So we'll pick exotic armor pieces that buff the glaive melee damage, and we can do that on all 3 classes. Hunters have a dedicated glaive exotic in Triton Vice which triples our glaive melee damage when surrounded, as well as overflowing projectile rounds into the magazine on the melee final blows. Plus, projectile takedowns cause enemies to explode, making ranged ad clear more effective too. Titans can use Syntheseps for a similar 2.65 times glaive melee damage when surrounded, or Worm Gods to build stacks of Burning Fists on melee final blows up to a maximum 5 times damage bonus. However, in practice I found that sometimes the melees wouldn't add to the Burning Fists bar, as I think the Scorch effect sometimes messes with them registering properly. But even if you only get the bar halfway, that's still a 2.4 times damage bonus. And Warlocks have Winter's Guile, which now work very similarly to Worm Gods, building stacks up to 5 times damage. But they have the same issue where sometimes the melees don't count because of the Scorch, but with enough ad clear you'll be building up stacks regardless. For weapons, kinetic and heavy are personal preference, but I found having a primary with Chaos Reshaped worked well to give additional chunk healing after being in combat for a while, and proccing ×2, which does work in the background even when stowed. And as the exotic slot is free, Tractor Cannon works nicely to debuff mini-bosses, or maybe even Heart Shadow to apply standard weaken as well as go invis on demand. The main weapon of course is the glaive itself, and for that I picked the Heron Aggressive Frame Void Glaive, available from the Lawless Events weapon engram at the Monument of Triumph kiosk. All glaive frames have the same melee combo dealing identical damage, but aggressives deal the most projectile damage per shot, 15% more than adaptives and 32% more than rapid fires. And as the combat loop is predominantly glaive melee spam with the occasional projectile shot, it's worth going for the higher damage option here. Perks are Repulsor Brace to give overshield on defeating void debuff targets for even more survivability, and in the second column there are 2 choices. Close to melee gives an additional 60% bonus damage to glaive melees after getting a ranged final blow, but remember, because melee damage buffs are now additive, that 60% buff from close to melee isn't as much of an increase as it seems, when our exotic armor is already increasing melee damage by between 3 and 5 times. So depending on the activity you're running, you might prefer to run Binary Orbit instead, which buffs the void projectile damage by 20% after getting a glaive melee kill. And for the mod, I'm running Synergy, which will occasionally spawn void breaches from projectile final blows. And the artifact which ties everything together is the NPA Repulsion Regulator. First up, Shatter Orbs for spawning an orb the first time a combatant's shield is broken. The description says this needs to be a matching element, but thankfully that's not true, as my glaive melees and projectiles were spawning orbs on non-matching shields. This is great for generating armor charge, enabling surges for glaive projectiles and other weapons, as well as stat font mods, especially as glaive melees don't count as powered melees, so they don't proc heavy-handed for orb generation, so with this mod you can still get reliable orb generation even if primarily just using the glaive melee. And this also helps with the second artifact mod, Volatile Flow, giving void weapons volatile rounds on orb pickup, helping make the glaive projectiles more effective for ad clear, as well as proccing Repulsor Brace to grant a full void overshield. Suppressing glaive suppresses enemies from glaive, melee and projectile hits for crowd control, and also procs Repulsor Brace as the suppress effect counts as void suppression, not a generic disorient. Although you will need to get the final blow with the glaive projectile, as a final blow with the glaive melee doesn't grant the overshield. Note that applying this suppression effect with a glaive melee hit does consume a small amount of glaive energy, and if empty won't apply the suppress, so you will need to get projectile hits occasionally to keep it topped up. We'll be doing this anyway as part of the combat loop, just something to be aware of. Protective Breach gives even more overshield when collecting Void Breaches, which will spawn occasionally from glaive projectile takedowns due to the Synergy mod. Countercharge grants an armor charge stack when stunning champions, and honestly this is only on here because there was nothing else available that really works with the build. Supernova causes void damage from our glaive projectiles to emit a large weakening pulse after picking up a Void Breach for even more effective ad clear and repulsor brace procs. And finally, Passive Aggressive Guard gives us additional damage resistance while wielding a glaive near combatants. Armour mods are pretty simple. On Helmet, Void Siphon for Orb Gen on glaive projectile multi-kills and Special Finder. Arms are Void Loader and Grenade or Melee Font if needed. Chest for Resist mods with Concussive Dampener, Melee Resist and an Elemental Resist based on enemy type or activity burn. Boots I've gone with Triple Void Surge for 22% bonus damage to glaive projectiles. And class item, Time Dilation for longer armor charge, Powerful Attraction for collecting orbs on class ability, and Reaper for generating an orb on weapon final blow after using class ability. But remember, this needs to be a glaive projectile final blow, not a glaive melee. So that's the build. To go over the combat loop once more, first proc Radiant from Acrobat Dodge or Powered Melee depending on class, throw Healing Nade for restoration, get a couple of projectile hits to give glaive energy so suppressing glaive will proc, and then just start ad clearing with the Scorching Glaive melee of the set bonus, refreshing Radiant and Restoration from Ember of Empyrean as you go. Shatter Orbs will spawn for Surges, Volatile Flow and Font mods, and occasionally get some final blows with the glaive projectiles to give you overshield from Repulsor Brace and spawn Void Breaches for weakening pulses, and then just repeat the loop. If Radiant or Restoration runs out, just use abilities to start them up again, and of course you can also use the glaive shield if needed when under heavy fire. And you can also throw in the occasional finisher to proc the 2-piece set bonus for extra healing when shields are broken. I know this is a bit of a weird one, but I did have a lot of fun with the build as I'm a big fan of unusual interactions between different systems, and there's no denying its effectiveness even under-leveled. Thanks for watching, leave any questions in the comments, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. See you on the next one.